Aren't you glad you're a Christian? Okay, here was our memory verse from last week, Ephesians 4:29. Let's say it together. Let no unwholesome word proceed from your mouth, but only such a word as is good for edification according to the need of the moment, that it may give grace to those who hear. Amen. All right, if you would be turning back to the book of James. Now, last week we looked at his discussion on the tongue. And we saw that while the tongue is small, the use of the tongue is not a small, inconsequential matter. Now, since that is true, we all need to work really hard to tame the tongue, to get it under control. Well, in this next section, James returned to the theme of wisdom, first found in chapter 1, verses 5 through 8. And it seems to form a bridge between the misuse of the tongue in chapter 3 and the conflicts of chapter 4. Now, some suggest that James was still directing his words at the teachers that he warned in chapter 3, verse 1. But it certainly fits as a general admonition to every Christian. All right, so what do you think of when you hear the word wisdom? Maybe an owl comes to mind, or someone with glasses and gray hair, or someone with a bunch of diplomas on their wall, a bunch of degrees. Wisdom, it's a pretty lofty term, isn't it? We usually think of those who possess wisdom as being more sophisticated, or in possession of greater knowledge, or they have risen to higher levels of insight than the rest of us. Those who achieve it are seen as a cut above. They have ascended to the more admirable levels of human existence. But as we've seen from the book of James, biblical wisdom is not speaking of intelligence or academic achievement or something like that. So I'm convinced that the wisdom that James is talking about is the ability to see things from God's perspective. We look at the things of this realm from God's point of view. You might call it heavenly insight. If you could put yourself in the position of God and sit on His throne, if you will, and see what He sees, then you'd be truly wise. In our section for today, James pointed out that there are two kinds of wisdom. There's a wisdom from above and a wisdom, not from above. Now, have any of you ever watched the old television game show, Let's Make a Deal? Okay, it's been around since 1963. And so if you haven't, you're probably at least aware of it. Well, this is not like Let's Make a Deal where you don't know what's under the box or behind the door or behind the curtain. It might be a zonk, and you just gave up something really good. No, James, he went ahead and he opened up both doors. He wanted to show us so that we could clearly see both of our options, and sure enough, one of them is definitely a zonk. We often like to compare things side by side. At least I do. Sometimes teachers will assign their students a compare and contrast essay. Amazon, it has their compare with similar items feature, which I like. And there are certainly many, many articles and these YouTube videos online that will compare the different items that are out there, the products that we can buy. And it's nice to have things placed side by side so we can make an informed decision. And that's what James did for us. Now, there are a number of words in this section that need to be explained. And so you may need to bear with me a little bit as we go through them, but I think it's worth it. So let's start with verses 13 and 14. Thinking you are wise. Who among you is wise and understanding? Let him show by his good behavior his deeds in the gentleness of wisdom. But if you have bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in your heart, do not be arrogant and so lie against the truth. And so he began his discussion with this challenging question. Some of you think that you're wise and understanding, but are you really? In the start of chapter 4, he's going to talk about church disunity and division. And sadly, Division it's often instigated by those who think. They think themselves to be wise and understanding. So I suspect James had people like that in mind. Those who have elevated themselves above others, claiming to have more insight. The problem is, someone who thinks that they possess wisdom, they may not actually have the wisdom from above. And if you only possess that wisdom, which is not from above, then you're not really wise, no matter what you might think or claim or how loud you might claim it. James told us that we exhibit whether or not we are truly wise by our conduct. Let him show. Just as one shows faith by deeds, chapter 2, verse 18. A mere verbal claim to wisdom, that's no better than a verbal claim to faith. Wisdom, it can be seen in the conduct of a person's life, not in grandiose claims, not in diplomas on the wall, or something like that. It's not merely words of wisdom, but works of wisdom. Now, don't just tell me you're wise, show me that you're wise. A practical demonstration. There's a story about a little country store owner whose business was not doing well. The business was always struggling. He's one of the poorest guys in town. Well, he ended up taking a trip to New York City. And he was just amazed at the big and beautiful stores on Fifth Avenue. Being from the country, he had never seen anything like it. And one thing that he noticed is they always had these lit up storefronts with mannequins or other means to display what they were selling, the merchandise that they had inside. And he started thinking about how, well, he just had a little sign out front that listed a few of the items that he had. So the guy, he went back home. And he tore out a section of his store and he built, sure enough, a window front. And he started displaying his merchandise. Well, guess what? His business, it started to grow and grow until it got to the point where he was one of the wealthiest people in town. And so you might say, James doesn't want us to just talk about our merchandise, but to display it. Well, there are a couple of things he mentioned about this conduct. The first is good behavior. Does the person claiming to be wise exhibit a well-lived life? So true wisdom will show itself by the deeds of a proper lifestyle. You shouldn't think that someone is wise if they don't have good behavior. A spoiled brat or someone who's out of control is not wise. Now, ask some of your secular non-Christian friends who they think the wise of this age are. Just see what kind of answers you get. Now, I suspect that you're going to get some movie stars, athletes, and politicians, the rich and famous or the powerful. But all you've got to do is look at their actions and look at their messed up lives to realize that they certainly do not have what James called the wisdom from above. All right, well, the second is gentleness. And this is a term, it's often translated as meekness. It's speaking of power under control. And many people, when they hear the term meekness, they think of weakness, a lack of power or strength, maybe someone who's frail and nervous. That is not at all what the Greek word means. This word was used to describe a wild animal that had been tamed and brought under control. For example, the ox has great strength. It has the ability to cause all kinds of damage, but one with this quality allows itself to be yoked and directed. And so unlike weakness, meekness or gentleness is a conscious choice. It's having the power to do something, but restraining from it. See, this person is in complete control of his or her actions toward others. Meekness, that is the opposite of pride and arrogance and a haughty spirit. It's the opposite of someone who is prone to outbursts of anger and violence toward others. The truly wise man or woman is not one who attempts to ride roughshod over other people. No, they certainly stand for what is right. All right, this is not a word against being a truth seeker and wanting to stand on the truth, but they do so in a kind and gentle manner, not with a domineering attitude. True wisdom will display itself in gentle treatment of others. The opposite of good behavior and gentleness is bitter jealousy and selfish ambition. So according to James, exhibiting these would indicate that your claim to be wise and understanding, it's without foundation. These are terms, of course, that are speaking of rivalry. Now, any Christian who harbors a kind of rivalry attitude will usually say and do things that promote strife among the brethren. And since it's in their heart, well, they may never verbalize it. Jealousy. Okay, that is when we become displeased when we hear or we see someone else doing well. We hear of their advantage or their prosperity. Have you ever had someone come up to you and they tell you how blessed they are, especially when you're not doing so well? The Lord blessed me with a promotion at work and a brand new truck, and I just won this award. And on top of that, the elders really liked my idea for the new class. And you're going, praise God. I'm excited for you. Well, you're gritting your teeth. All right, what about selfish ambition? Well, I read that this was a term used by Aristotle to refer to partisan political fights. So think of the politician, the political candidate running for office who will use just about any means possible. So this seems to be speaking of those who want to make a name for themselves by putting down the opposition. Unrestrained self-promotion is often done at the expense of others, talking other people down to try to raise yourself up. So I think James is referring to someone who was driven by the pride of life. 1 John 2:16, and probably thinking only of immediate gain. Now, is that wise? Having bitter jealousy and selfish ambition? Well, no, it's simply immaturity. That's immaturity, and deep down we know it's wrong. In such a case, James declared, don't be arrogant and so lie against the truth. Well, the arrogance here seems to be in making the claim that we are wise when it's obvious that we are not. Now, you remember chapter 1, verse 5. James exhorted those who lack wisdom to seek it from where? From God. But such conduct, as he mentioned here, it can certainly not be construed as coming from God. And so again, genuine wisdom, it's not merely what we know, but also what we do. If wisdom is indeed insight from God, then the way that we treat people, the way that we react to the circumstances of life, it should reflect God's perspective. Well, the rest of the text then makes this comparison between these two types of wisdom, the two types of wisdom that's out there. And James indicated that we can know if we are truly wise because we will exhibit the characteristics of the wisdom from above, and we will see the positive results that come from it. So we started with a look at the wisdom not from above in verses 15 and 16. He said, this wisdom is not that which comes down from above, but is earthly, natural, demonic. For where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there is disorder and every evil thing. Many people think that there's wisdom or common sense in selfish ambition and self-promoting. Looking out for number one, it seems to do pretty well out in the world, at least for a while. But James, he exposed what it really is. And there are three characteristics of this wisdom. And these terms, they kind of run together, but they seem to go from bad to worse. First, it is earthly. It's merely human. It's not from God. Earthly wisdom consists of having an earthly perspective of things. Some people, they only live for the here and now. And so their main focus and ambition in life is to enhance their earthly well-being. They got little or no thought of heaven, and it's really no interest in spiritual things because, you see, they don't advance them in their pursuits of this world. And so these people exhibit selfish ambition, and they're certainly not going to deal gently with others around them. They might see the world as a dog-eat-dog and an every man for himself kind of existence. And sadly, some people even have earthbound motives when they're talking about heavenly things or engaging in religious activities. Okay, second, it is natural or unspiritual. Now, I think this would describe a person who measures everything by physical standards and physical desires, which makes him incapable of understanding spiritual things. And this word could be used of the skeptic, who mocks the existence of God and the miracles of the Bible and the spirit realm, since they're unscientific. If you can't prove it empirically with your five senses, then it must not exist. See, to him, the only standard of right and wrong is what man determines. So if man determines that aborting babies is right, then it's right. I mean, such things as bitter jealousy and selfish ambition fit just fine. They could hardly be considered wrong. And so this wisdom is really acting as if there is nothing but the natural, the physical realm. And the third, it is demonic. It is connected to Satan, the ruler of the demons. And see, just as the tongue can be set on fire by hell, chapter 3, verse 6, this wisdom has its source in the realm of Satan. So with this term, we're going to see just how far away this is from the true wisdom, because it refers to a man who thinks like Satan. He's thinking like the devil, or as the devil wants him to think. This person's perspective on life is live for the moment, live for yourself, do whatever makes you happy. There's no moral base. There's no care for the consequences of his or her action. I mean, they will even attack things that God thinks are right and good. And so this wisdom, it's really lining up with the enemies of God. And as you can see, James, he certainly didn't pull any punches. Now, sadly, a lot of the politically correct stuff these days could fit under one of these three. They think it's wise, the PC crowd. They think that's great wisdom. But I'm reminded of Proverbs 14:12. There is a way which seems right to a man, but its end is the way of death. Well, James then showed the results of this kind of wisdom in verse 16. So disorder, and this word refers to instability and confusion, and disturbance. Things like jealousy and selfish ambition, they cause instability and restlessness in the mind, in human relationships, and in the church. I mean, it's pretty obvious when we've got rivalry and a party spirit that, well, the church is going to experience disunity and it's going to experience disturbance. See, church splits, they're sometimes the result of leaders who think they are wise and understanding, but they're exhibiting earthly, natural, and demonic behavior in the way that they conduct themselves. So I think we can conclude that whenever we see disorder among Christians and those who engage in things like splitting churches, they're not exhibiting the wisdom from above. And then every evil, or it could be translated worthless thing. Now this just covers just about everything that's negative and ungodly, all that is evil and bad and underhanded and mean and worthless in the world. It's derived from earthly wisdom, not heavenly. And so these two fruits substantiate that this wisdom is clearly not from God. He is not a God of confusion. 1 Corinthians 14:33. And he is separated from every evil thing. 1 John chapter 1, verse 5. All right, let's go now to the wisdom from above in verses 17 and 18. But the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, reasonable, full of mercy and good fruits, unwavering, without hypocrisy. And the seed whose fruit is righteousness, is sown in peace by those who make peace. Okay, there are 7 characteristics of this wisdom. These are really good. So let's go through them. Pure. Jesus said, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God." This means without defilement. As James mentioned in chapter 1, verse 27, being unstained by the world. Pure, it implies moral and spiritual virtue. See, there's no sin or impurity with God. And so we must strive for that same characteristic if we are operating from God's wisdom. Okay, in Genesis 39, you remember Potiphar's wife. Well, she made advances toward Joseph, and he might have been able to get away with it. But he said, "How then could I do this great evil and sin against God?" Now, I know a fellow preacher that I was acquainted with who ended up having an affair with a woman in his congregation. He sinned against God and against his family, and it cost him much. Who was wiser, Joseph or this preacher? Now, doing the right thing, it had immediate negative consequences for Joseph, but long-term positive consequences. The opposite was true for this preacher. Purity is the way of true wisdom. Proverbs 21:8, "The way of a guilty man is crooked, but as for the pure, his conduct is upright." Peaceable. Jesus said, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God." And that's peacemakers, P-E-A-C-E, and not P-I-E-C-E. See, this is the opposite of the disorder that James mentioned as a result of the worldly wisdom. Some people just seem to get their jollies from being contentious. Do you love peace, or do you love to agitate people and cause arguments and problems? Christians who operate in this world in peaceable ways are striving to live in harmony with their friends and their family and their neighbors and their coworkers and their church. And yes, some folks are not interested in peace, but as Paul said in Romans chapter 12, verse 18, "If possible, so far as it depends on you, be at peace with all men." Being peaceable is the way of true wisdom. In Proverbs 3:17, wisdom it's personified as a woman whose ways are pleasant ways and her paths are peace. Gentle. Jesus said, "Blessed are the gentle, for they shall inherit the earth." And that's the word James used in verse 13. Now, this is a different word here in verse 17, but it has a similar meaning. It's the absence of bad manners and a quick temper. It's being considerate and having the ability to exhibit forbearance. Now, we might think of Shimei throwing rocks at David and cursing him in 2 Samuel chapter 16. Well, one of David's soldiers, Abishai, he wanted to go over there and just kill him, kill Shimei. But David told Abishai, just leave him alone. Abishai was operating on the level of earthly wisdom, but David, at least at that time, had more of a heavenly perspective. Well, Paul used this term in Philippians 4 in verse 5. "Let your forbearing or gentle spirit be known to all men." Gentleness is the way of true wisdom. Reasonable or willing to yield. Jesus said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." It's true wisdom to live your life not thinking too highly of yourself. This characteristic is opposite of someone who is dogmatic and unyielding in his or her dealings with people. This unreasonable person is one who is self-absorbed, someone who is a know-it-all. They won't admit when they're wrong. And some people, they go through life thinking that they are the only one who is wise and understanding. It's like that quote from Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice. I am Sir Oracle, and when I ope my lips, let no dog bark. Wow. Unreasonable people prefer to win arguments rather than find truth when there's a difference of belief in a church. So here's a question. Would a church have division and be in a mess if it had reasonable people who were genuine truth seekers? Probably not. Reasonable people are not interested in promoting themselves, but rather they want to do what is right. And so are we stubborn and conceited and unyielding, or are we able to listen to reason? Proverbs 12:15. The way of a fool is right in his own eyes, but a wise man is he who listens to counsel. And Proverbs 19:20. Listen to counsel and accept discipline, that you may be wise the rest of your days. Am I reasonable and listen to people, or do I just attack them? Being reasonable is the way of true wisdom. Full of mercy and good fruit. These are connected with the conjunction and so he really has one thing in mind. Jesus said, "Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy." And have mercy is to have compassion and to withhold punishment. If you plead for the mercy of the court, well, you're saying, I know I'm guilty, but I'm asking for leniency. Please don't give me what I deserve. Now, it also means that we want to reach out and help those who are destitute and in need of help. It's rendering aid to those who are in distress. And it's not that they deserve our help. No, it's out of our own sense of compassion that we assist them in any way that we can. And so our mercy will produce good fruit. That's the message of the parable, Jesus' parable of the Good Samaritan in Luke chapter 10. When the traveler was beaten and robbed and left for dead, well, you would expect the priest and the Levite who passed by to help him, but they didn't. Instead, it was a Samaritan, someone who was hated by the Jews, who had compassion and exhibited the good fruits of mercy. The priest and the Levite exhibited wisdom not from above. So you can identify a tree by its fruit. Jesus, as he said in Matthew 7:20, so then you will know them by their fruits. And you notice how James said full. And so it's like a really good fruit tree that's just full of fruit. Full of mercy and good fruits is the way of true wisdom. Unwavering or not divided. Now this might contrast the double-minded man mentioned in chapter 1, verse 8 and chapter 4, verse 8. This is the person who, well, they're not vacillating back and forth. They're not divided in their mind. Some Christians are hot and cold. Sometimes they're on fire for the Lord, and, well, other times. See, this might describe Peter, at least at that one point, who could boast of his willingness to die for the Lord and then turn around and just deny that he knew him 3 times. A person who is unwavering is consistent. They have integrity. And as an example, will keep his or her word. See, if he says he's going to do something, man, you can bank on it. Jesus taught us in the Sermon on the Mount that, well, we need to be unwavering when we say yes or no. If you say yes, you mean yes. If you say no, you mean no. And James is also going to talk about that in chapter 5. Well, some versions translate our word here as impartial. And you remember his discussion in chapter 2 on having double standards when it comes to how we treat people. Now, that would fit under this as well. Unwavering is the way of true wisdom. without hypocrisy. The hypocrite is putting on an act. In Greek, this was the usual term for an actor. See, in a play or a movie, an actor pretends to be something he or she is not, and the goal is to be as believable as possible. Now that's often the way of the world, but not of someone who possesses the wisdom from above. And that was a major problem in Jesus' day with some of the religious leaders. And so he made that statement. It would have been a very shocking statement to his audience. For I say to you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees, you shall not enter the kingdom of heaven. So sadly, there are some people who wear the mask of Christianity, but they're really something else. The opposite of hypocrisy is sincerity and genuineness, to present yourself to others as you really are. In Matthew 6:1, Jesus said, "Beware of practicing your righteousness before men to be noticed by them." No, don't put on a show so people will think you're deeply religious. Without hypocrisy is the mark of true wisdom. And so, if I think I'm wise, or I'd like to be wise, well, then I need to ask, am I displaying these 7 attributes? No, the results of this kind of wisdom are given in verse 18. And the seed whose fruit is righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. The wording is a bit awkward in English, and the scholars will argue about the best way to translate it. It may be as the NIV. Peacemakers who sow in peace raise a harvest of righteousness. You know, in a context of people who are fighting and biting, just fighting and they're quarreling and they're dividing, I think James is saying that the wisdom from above strives for peace. So, who are the ones exhibiting God's wisdom? Who are the ones who will end up with a harvest of righteousness? It's those who are intent on maintaining peace and harmony among the brethren. They are sowing peace. We all need to ask, what am I sowing? In the list of the 7 things that God hates in Proverbs chapter 6, the last one is one who spreads or sows strife among brothers. Those exhibiting the heavenly insight will work toward peace. Now, worldly wisdom, on the other hand, it's marked by jealousy and selfish ambition. It always disrupts relationships and causes disorder and every evil thing. There will always be people who claim to be wise and understanding. But do they really have the true wisdom, the wisdom from above? You see, every now and then you're going to come across someone who thinks he or she has the monopoly on biblical truth, or just all the right answers in general. And if you disagree with them in any way, shape, or form, then you are clearly wrong and you need to adjust your thinking, period. And if you don't, they will throw a fit and cause division in the church, and guess what? They'll end up blaming it on you. Quarrels and fighting in a church, and I think this would also apply to a physical family as well. It's a pretty clear indication that there are at least some who are not behaving according to wisdom. Whenever we got a conflict in a congregation, we need to ask ourselves if we are exhibiting conduct according to the wisdom of God or simply the wisdom of men, the wisdom of the world. See, true wisdom, it seeks purity. It seeks peace. It's not selfish. It's not about worldly success and stuff like that. It takes great courage, doesn't it? It takes great character to not be influenced by it. It's always in our face. We need to reject that worldly wisdom. It's this ongoing struggle for us to overcome the perspectives of the world and to see things from the perspective of God. Romans 12:2. And do not be conformed to the world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. As Christians, we can't let ourselves get sucked into it and get caught up in the wisdom of men. Our challenge then for this week is to take a real good look, each of us to do some self-examination to see if we're following true wisdom. Sadly for many, only the judgment day will supply the answer. Who among you is wise and understanding?